So today's coffee chat is about grant writing for local resilience projects. You'll hear from grant writing experts, managers, and reviewers from the public and private sector. Learn about the grant writing process, tips and tricks to enhance future grant proposals. We will have a chance at the end of the coffee chat to discuss current funding opportunities for local resilience projects with our panel of speakers. So I'll go ahead and kick things off. Here are our grant writing panel speakers today. We have Jim Rutella, who is the president of Rutella Associates, a coastal planning firm. Rutella Associates has secured and managed over $1 billion in funding for a wide variety of resiliency projects. Mr. Rutella has a master's degree in city and regional planning from The Ohio State University and an MBA from Rutgers University. Our next panel speaker is Leah Yasenchek. She's a principal at BRS, a New Jersey-based consulting firm that helps public sector and nonprofit clients implement economic development and resiliency initiatives, where she oversees the firm's practice areas of grant services and planning. Under Leah's leadership, the BRS grants team has obtained over $500 million for their clients. And last but not least, we have Jody Veller. She is a public sector professional with over 20 years of experience in the field of community economic development. She has worked in a wide range of government and nonprofit organizations, gaining knowledge in a variety of subject matters, including human services, housing development, urban agriculture, youth services, and grant writing and management. Dr. Veller currently works as a grant manager for the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and as a contracted federal grant reviewer. So to kick us off today, we will have Jim Rutella from Rutella Associates, who will kick off our first presentation today. And Jim, if you can see my screen and you can come off mute.
Yep. We're good. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
It's really appropriate. This is called Building Partnerships and Networks to advance resiliency. Resiliency projects are always complicated. They're never simple. And it really does take a network to get things done. You need to have a lot of support, a lot of individuals involved, and really have a firm foundation. Next slide. Just some of the things that are needed. A lot of communities and individuals think that you can apply for a grant and anyone can compete. It's not really the case. There's a number of things you need to do in advance to really be grant ready. You really need to have strong relationships with everyone involved. The funding agencies really need to know what they're looking for. It may mean, picking up the phone or having an email conversation or going to pre-grant webinars. But whatever you need, you really do need to understand exactly what they want and have a relationship with them. They need to know that they need to have confidence in you as a community, as an individual, because they're obviously responsible for the funds. Accountability is an important element as well. As I just mentioned, no funding agency wants to give funds to a community or individual who is not accountable, does not have good financial skills, financial staff, good engineering staff, good management staff. So that's all important. Because in a sense, what you do reflects on their careers to a certain extent. You need to have a network of support. No one wants to fund a project that everyone does not support. If it's a controversial project, a lot of folks will stay away from it. So you really do need to build a level of support before you even put together an application. That way you know that you can demonstrate that there's a community behind you. Leveraging is always important. leveraging, is other people's money, or that in addition to the grant, that can help to make the grant application look more attractive. And magic is an element. Sometimes it takes people to be involved, to really push your agenda. And it's important that whatever the project is, that a lot of people, especially your legislators and people of leadership, know about the project and can talk about the project because they're your advocates. They can really help when push comes to shove. Next slide. There's all sorts of other people's money. Some folks just look at one source. We really use everything, and we have many projects that have had philanthropic dollars and corporate dollars and nonprofit dollars. The more folks you can have involved to leverage a project, the easier the project becomes. So finding other people's money along the way is important as well. Next slide. I was asked to present a case study. So we do work from Toms River to Cape May. We do several 8-digit capital projects, resiliency projects. We're working on a seawall project in Cape May right now. But this project is a seawall project in Atlantic City. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see what this area looked like right after Superstorm Sandy. The area was pummeled, the boardwalk area was destroyed, the land area behind it was flooded, and this is a very low-lying area of the city along the inlet. And it's interesting, the Army Corps had developed a plan for this area, including a seawall, a hard structure, because it's a very violent area. There's high winds, high wave action. And the DEP said that it would never be permanent. They said that they wanted a soft solution here. And that was one of the first challenges for a project like this. And fortunately, we were able to get the commissioner of DEP to endorse the project and to move things forward in the permitting process. But it's just one of the many challenges that you'll have with a project like this. Next slide. This slide depicts what's there now. A new $60 million seawall was built. It extends over 1.5 miles from Ocean Resort to Gardner's Basin Park. It's fully completed, had 8 different funding sources, and is now generating development in the area that was once flooded. The area now is well protected by a significant seawall. This boardwalk area is about 10 feet higher than what was there previously. So you can just get some understanding of the massive nature of this seawall. But from a funding standpoint, if you go to the next slide, again, it was about a $60 million project. The first funding for this project was a $500,000 grant from DCA. $500,000 wasn't going to get much done, but it was enough to get everybody interested and to get people to understand that this was a project that was worthwhile being a partner in. The Army Corps was a huge partner, actually built a portion of the project. EDA was a great partner. EDA had funding after Superstorm Sandy to do resiliency projects. DOT, not normally someone who you would think about in a resiliency project, but they funded a portion of this as well. DEP, both coastal engineering and Green Acres funding was used. And of course, FEMA was a major player. And there was also private funds that were used on the project. So it really does take to make something like this happen, something this large, it takes many players and a lot of coordination. Next slide. So some of the challenges on any resiliency project. Local engagement and support is imperative, especially with resiliency. People are concerned about the height of seawalls, the height of bulkheads, Impacts on views, impacts on their quality of life. And in a lot of cases, it takes, a lot of education to get people to understand that the world's changing and that, these types of improvements are necessary. And we had several public meetings on those types of topics just to get people understanding what the future holds. We like to make our clients a star. At the end of the day, it's really their project. And the more that they can feel good about it, the more that they can be engaged throughout the process, the better off you are for both this project as well as for future projects. The real goal is to eliminate issues as they come up and keep people informed and certainly at the end of the day, make them a star. Make the funding, whoever the funders are, proud to be part of the project. Again, in many cases, you're dealing with career government folks, it's very important to them in their career as to whether the projects they're involved with are successful. And certainly that has to be one of our goals as well, because none of these situations are a one and done situation. These are funding sources that you want to use in the future, and those relationships are very valuable as you move forward. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, and ties into the title of this coffee chat, is relationships. Writing a grant is critical and important, and you have to do everything appropriately. However, relationships at the end of the day is just as important and can certainly move a project forward. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And at this point, we will pass it off to Leah Yazinchek from BRS.
Hi, thank you. Hopefully you can see my screen. Yep.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So thanks, Jim. That is absolutely 100%, 1000% the case in terms of building relationships and pulling together the different funding sources. Once you have identified what grant you're going after, then you have to actually write the application. So I wanted to give you a little few tips and tricks on how to write a successful grant application. Let's see if I can figure out how to advance my slides. There we go. So first of all, it's going to take you longer than you think to write the grant application. It just does. It takes a lot of time, obviously, depending on the complexity of the project and the complexity of the application. It varies considerably, but it is a time-consuming process. So make sure you're budgeting enough time and make sure you're looking, you sort of are backing into the deadline. You certainly don't want to get to the point where you've invested a whole lot of time and you're not able to get the grant submitted by the deadline. And some of the things that you need to think about well in advance are, is a resolution required either by you or governing body or by the funder? Get that on the docket right away. Do you need support letters, commitment letters? Start reaching out to your partners right away about that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Are there any community notification requirements? Do you have to hold a public meeting? Do you need notification? You have to put an ad in the paper 15 days before the meeting or something like that. Make sure you're creating a schedule that backs into all of that. One thing, and Jim mentioned this as well, meet with the funders. And frequently, once the grant solicitation is out on the streets, the funders are barred from having those discussions with potential applicants. So, get an idea of what the funding sources are that you're interested in and meet with them ahead of time before the solicitation hits the street so that you can familiarize them with your project and also get some sense as to what portions of it they think are most fundable. Is this a strong project? And very important, make sure you have your credentials in place. It can take a long time to get your SAM, your getting registered in Sage. We've had people who the entity that was authorized in one of these online portals has retired and nobody can access their emails, and it can be a headache. So make sure that you do that right off the bat, that you have the credentials in place to be able to actually submit it. And then, of course, you need to develop a strong project idea. So think about how your project is differentiated from other projects, because it may very well be fit in with the parameters. But if you're saying things that every single other applicant is able to say, your project isn't going to be differentiated. So really think about, put the reviewer in the community and let them understand how this project is transformative for your community and the difference that it will make. And consider all the potential components of the project. So if you're looking at flooding in your downtown, it isn't just about the flooding, right? It's also about how it negatively affects cultural assets or community health, how it's compromising public safety. Think about all of the elements that are impacted so that you can kind of pull those pieces into the narrative. And then think about how you would go about actually implementing it. And, do you need to budget some funds for salary and fringe? Are there going to be education expenses? Really pull, and I'll talk a little bit more about the budget, but really make sure you're thinking through the details about implementation. And also, make sure that you're actually eligible, because there are eligibility requirements for both the applicants and the project elements. So don't waste your time if you're not eligible, or you really need to acquire property and acquisition is an ineligible expense. And so if you aren't able to do that acquisition, the whole project falls apart. Really do a close look before you invest too much time to make sure that this is the correct funding source for your project. And if you aren't an eligible applicant, it provides an opportunity to potentially partner with an eligible applicant. So if you're a nonprofit and only government entities are eligible, you can establish a partnership and apply that way. Community support, and Jim mentioned this as well. Community support is really important. Sometimes it's a requirement, but it's always a good thing to have. And pay attention to what sort of support letters are being requested. Oftentimes, the funders aren't looking for just generic letters of support. They're looking for commitment letters. So my nonprofit group is going to provide meeting space. My organization is going to notify our constituencies in our newsletter about what's going on. Make sure that every letter has a specific commitment of how they're going to participate in the project. Oftentimes I see folks do just a generic form letter and send it out to everybody. I guess this is better than nothing, but it's not that much better than nothing. Like, you really should be targeting the support letters so that they're different. They are targeted toward what that particular organization is interested in that particular component of the project. And then make sure you have a variety of types of entities that support your project. So I have sort of my rule of 5. I want to get a faith-based organization. I want to get a educational organization. I want to get some sort of advocacy group, usually an environmental group and an economic group. So those are my sort of rule of 5. I make sure I have at least one community organization from each of those categories that are providing support for it. The budget, this is really the brains of the operation. So without a strong budget, if you start from the budget, the narrative will fall into place, because the narrative is based on what are the tasks that you are going to complete with this grant, and those are defined by the budget. And this is really where you can make sure that your whole narrative is holding together. Because if you're talking about doing items that aren't reflected in your budget, that's a red flag for reviewers. If you are talking about doing something in your budget that you don't discuss in your narrative, that's another red flag. So, make sure it all holds together. It's also important, a lot of organizations, smaller organizations, have difficulty implementing grants that are reimbursable grants. Many, many grants are reimbursable grants. So make sure that that is something that your organization is able to manage. And please put your budget in a spreadsheet and then copy it into whatever format you need to for the submission, because so frequently people have mathematical errors in the budget, and that's just not a good look. Also, if you can phase your project, think about that, because in some situations, funders are able to just are able to give you a portion of your ask. And so you want to make it easy for them to be able to do that. So Jim mentioned this too, in terms of leveraged funds. So oftentimes a match is required, and it's usually as a percentage of the overall project cost. We never recommend doing more match than is required, but definitely recommend putting in as much leveraged funding as you can. And that is because during the implementation, you'll be required to report on anything that you have said is going to be a match, and you'll be required to document it. So by offering up more of a match than is required, you're making the implementation harder on yourself. However, if you do show that you have all of these leveraged funds, that is definitely a competitive boon as your reviewers are looking through it. And look at the different components of the project as well. So it might be that you are funding just the acquisition with this grant, but then how are you going to get the funds to do the demolition? How are you going to get the funds to do the development? Talk about what sources of funds are available for you to access, that so that the funder knows it's not just going to end, that the project is going to go all the way to a community benefit.
Leah,
The narrative needs to.
Maybe you could answer this question really quick before you move on.
Mm-hmm.
What's the main difference between leveraged and matched funds?
Okay, that's a really great question. So matched funds, first of all, as I said, are required, and you're required to report on them. So if it's a 20% match required, usually the way that funders handle that is, if you send in an invoice for $100, they'll reimburse you $80. So, you really need to make sure that you have that and you have that documented. Leveraged funding, and they can only be for items that are eligible under the grant. So, you can't, if only construction costs, say, are eligible under the grant, you can't match that with soft costs. So it's only for eligible activities. Leveraged funding is broader. It can cover other components of the project that are not necessarily in the time frame or the eligibility of the grant, and it's not something that you are required to meet when you are putting in your reporting. So hopefully that answered the question, but happy to go on and on ad nauseum about the difference between match and leverage funding if anybody wants. But when you're developing your narrative, make sure that your story is compelling. We say, make them cry, let them know how important this is to your community. Make sure that the priorities are clearly defined, and that the reviewers can see that thread throughout the entire grant application. And again, make sure that what you're saying about your community is not something that every single other applicant is saying about their community. Make sure that you're differentiating it. Obviously, read the directions. Everything I ever learned about grant writing, I learned in kindergarten. That used to be a popular series, I guess. So make sure that you're following the directions and that you're doing it in the order that they ask for. So, and frequently when you're going through these, you're going to think, oh my God, I already answered that. I'm not answering that again. No, you think you answered it, but the funders want something slightly different, some nuance. Put yourself in the funder's perspective and try and figure out what that nuance is that they're trying to get at by asking what seems to be the same question, but in a slightly different way. And make sure you answer it. And if the answer is not applicable, put not applicable or explain why it's not applicable. Don't just leave it blank, because then you won't get any points for it. It's really helpful to get somebody to read through your grant application that isn't intimately familiar with your project after you put it together, just to get that outside perspective and make sure it makes sense and that you're not using something jargony, or that you're not assuming somebody understands something about the project or the community that you haven't specified. So if you have time, if you can budget the time in for that, that's super helpful. And this is the extraneous information is something that I find people have a lot of difficulty with, but if you don't need it in there, don't put it in there. I remember I was working with a company and they really wanted to talk about how this one building used to be a library that Ben Franklin went to. And I was like, it doesn't matter. That has nothing to do with what we're trying to get. And it's just distracting. So make sure that you're being very, very targeted in what you choose to say. And then make sure that your project is realistic, because the people reviewing it have reviewed a lot of these and they know they can smell out when a project can't be done for the dollar amounts that you're asking for. I already covered that. So answer all the questions. Don't just skip over it. The proposal checklists are really helpful. Most of the funders do include a checklist. Make sure that you use it and make sure that you have everything. And all of these projects typically come with a time frame, so make sure that your schedule fits in with that time frame, that you can act, and then it's actually doable. So after the awards get announced, there's a lot of things that you have to do, and I think Jody's going to go into that piece of it. But just to say that, like, the application's the easy part. Actually managing it is quite an effort, and you need to make sure that you're being realistic and setting up the systems required to do that management. You may need to fill out a whole bunch of forms. You may need to do a work plan. You certainly would need to execute a grant agreement. And then you need to be really cognizant of the terms and conditions, because there's all different requirements that you have to follow. And if you don't follow them, then you are jeopardizing not only this grant, but future grants from that funder, because you need to be able to demonstrate that you have the programmatic capacity to implement a grant, not just the project part, but the actual grant part and the reporting. And so that is all I had, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Leah. And at this time, we will have Jody Viller come on and share her screen. And I saw you nodding at a lot of things that Leah was saying, so. And you are muted.
Okay, let's see if I can get back to where I was.
We can see your screen.
I can't see my screen. I knew this was not a great idea. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't want to, in the interest of not going over, a lot of things that Jim and Leah spoke about, I'm going to come at this a little bit more from the perspective of the reviewer. I do a lot of federal grant reviews. I also do some grants management, even here at the DEP. I manage a bridge grant for folks, and I do a lot of curating of grants for the DEP. Why is this? Okay. So I do a lot of curating of grants on grants.gov. Federal grants are really what I kind of specialize in. You can find grants anywhere. There are foundation grants all over Google, and there are plenty of grants on Candid, which is a database that you can get into through most of the libraries. So they're out there. You can find them easily enough. But after you locate it, make sure that you look at your key dates for submission. And as Leah mentioned, your submission requirements, you need to be registered with the right database, are letters of support required, and all that good stuff. One of the things that I find is that people don't always do their research. Check the internet, take a look at if the grant has been funded in the past, what exactly did they fund? Because you really want your criteria to align with what was funded in the past. And sometimes we can get a little bit excited and the criteria really doesn't work because the grant is being interpreted in pieces and not generally as a whole. Every federal grant, you'll find a table of contents. It's easy to break down the grant. They will tell you exactly what they're going to be looking for in the grant review information. There is the evaluation criteria, how they're going to do the selection process is all right there. When you're writing it, please remember that there are page limits, and reviewers will only evaluate what they're allowed to evaluate. We won't go past that. So look at your points. When you're looking at the evaluation criteria, and this I pulled directly from a NOAA grant, they'll tell you 0 to 100 points based on the standards. So when you're looking at the first standard, it's 35 points for the relevance and applicability of the proposal. When you're looking at the sustainability issue, it's only 11 points. And yes, they're breaking it down and they're telling you exactly how many points you're getting for each. But remember that 35 points really has to be done well. If you only get 6 points out of the 11 points, you're probably still going to be in the running. So when you're looking at the basic questions for the narrative, generally I use my entire narrative page allotment. If I am under that page allotment by a lot, something is probably wrong. And you don't want to be over it either. And I think Leah mentioned this about focusing. You can't do everything. Don't try and put everything into this grant, especially if it doesn't really belong there. And make sure that you're applying for the right grant. Don't go for an implementation grant if there's a planning grant and you haven't done the planning, if you haven't done the community outreach. Those are the kind of things that tend to trip people up a little bit. And just make sure that you, again, do it in order. And Leah mentioned this, don't make the reviewer try and figure out and find everything. It makes it a lot harder to review the grant and they might miss things. So the grant reviewer's job is we're looking to eliminate the weak grants that are there. And some of the common mistakes that are made, and I think this was mentioned before about the dollar amount of the funding, don't try and get greedy and ask for $2 million if the project is only worth $1 million, because the reviewer is going to be able to tell that. Read between the lines of the grant. Don't try and make something fit that doesn't fit. Do your research on the grant and see what they funded in the past, and be clear. And again, as Leah mentioned this, don't put all of this information in the grant that doesn't have to do with the grant, but make sure that you put all the information in that's required, and don't stray from the core content of what the funder is looking for. This is one of the grants that I habitually review, and it is a farmers market promotion program. And when you look at it under the executive summary, they're telling you that the purpose is to support the development, coordination of expansion of direct producer to consumer markets to increase access to and availability of locally and regionally produced agricultural products. That's the core of the grant. That's the purpose. This is when it gets a little confusing, because people will read that it's to benefit underserved communities, food deserts, and they will start trying to make something fit that does not necessarily fit. So while the priority might be given to those communities, the purpose is direct producer to consumer. So when you write this for the USDA, you really can't write this for a supermarket. They don't particularly care about, selling toothpaste or toilet paper or anything like that. If you use the words local grocery or food co-op or farmers market, you have a much better chance of being in the pocket that they're looking for. When you look at what they won't fund, is anything that's not focused on directly from producer to consumer marketing. So you cannot do community gardens, you can't do sustenance farming, you can't do a lot of training. And this is, very often where things go wrong for people, because they're trying to take a program that doesn't really fit a grant and make that fit. And it just doesn't work. So my presentation, it was fairly short. And I will say that, a lot of the grant management that I do, again, as Leah pointed out, it can be significant to manage that grant. We awarded multiple grants here for a program that we ran for green job training, and it took months just to get the contracts put in place because there was a lot of additional documentation that the grantees had not sent in originally. So it's not considered a material defect to not have that in, but we're going to need it before it's funded. It was not totally a reimbursable grant, but again, you have to look at that to make sure, is it reimbursable? Will they give you a portion of the grant? Because that's going to impact how you are able to implement that grant. So that's all for me.
Thanks, Jody. We actually have a few questions for you from your presentation. Can you please speak more to the page limits? And are there keywords and indicators that a reviewer is looking for?
Yeah, they're in the review section and in the page limits. And when you do federal grants, they will tell you explicitly 1-inch margins, 12-point font, Times New Roman is always safe. They will give you the exact page limits for each section. So make sure you pay attention to them, because reviewers can't read past those sections. Generally, they take them out before they even get to the review panel. So if it's something that's critical and important, make sure that it's not at the end of that it's at the beginning of it, because the other thing that can be challenging is the database that you upload into, because grants.gov, things like that, you don't want it to chop off something that's majorly important when you put the grant in. So always just keep an eye on that.
I would also just jump in and say that oftentimes, like at the state grants, you're entering stuff directly into Sage, and those have character limits. So, you might be typing along, or you might be copying and pasting something that you created outside of the portal, and then it just cuts you off. It doesn't even let you enter characters beyond what they require. So in that case, you're prevented from going over the limit.
And then Jody, another question related to your PowerPoint is, how transparent is the point system with the applicant?
It's very transparent. Not only is it in the grant itself, well, not always in the grant, let me put it this way, but they will tell you exactly what they're looking for. Now, if you don't get the grant and you want to look at the points, you have the right to ask them for your scoring sheet and the reviewer's comments. Sometimes they give them to you, right out of the gate. Other times you have to request them. And I will give you a little secret. State and federal grants, any grant that is done with public money, technically is public domain. And while they're not putting the whole grant out there, you can request a copy of any grant that was awarded through the Freedom of Information Act or the Open Public Records Act. So if a grant is due annually, like it's a big grant, it comes out every year, and you're interested in writing it and you're unsure, you can request a copy of whatever winning grant there was. And I generally look for something that is similar to my community or similar to what I want to write, and then try and get the closest award-winning grant, and then go through the Freedom of Information Act or Oprah to get a copy of that grant and see how it was scored and what the reviewers looked for and what it says. And I find that helpful because I'm kind of visual with that.
Thank you. At this point, we have it opened up to our panelists. If anybody wants to come off mute and ask a question about their presentation, now is your chance. You can raise your hand, you can come off mute, you can enter questions in the chat. Yeah, Yasmin?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's a pleasure to meet all the panelists, and Amanda, good to see you again. I actually had a question for Jim as well. So Jim, how often do you use resources like LinkedIn to connect with potential, potential funders, building relationships? You spoke about building relationships as one of your points. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, I use LinkedIn and I mentioned here, trying to make your funders and the communities a star. And I use it to really complement the funders when, grants released, to let them know and let the world know that these grants are out there, that local communities have received them. And they really give the funders a pat on the back. And the same thing with the clients, the communities or individuals that have applied for the grants. And I find that to be very helpful. It's a very positive statement. You should really spread the word, and people understand, what the opportunities are that are out there. And I think it makes people feel good. So I think it's a good network to use.
Do you use any others or just LinkedIn?
No, just LinkedIn because it's more of a professional platform.
Anything else for our panelists? I can throw this question out to the group. Here we have one from Colleen. Are there specific considerations for coastal resilience grants?
I can start. I mean, I think one thing with coastal grants, and that's primarily what we work with. In many cases, you really need to work out the engineering. You really, it's not good enough to have a concept. There are projects, certainly I'll use the FEMA grants as an example. Not only do you have to have an H&H study and a benefit cost analysis done, but you really need to know that the project's going to work and be able to explain that in the application. So there's a lot of, especially with coastal grants, there's a lot of details that are needed. I think the engineering aspect is a key. Benefit cost analysis are a key. The economic impacts of the project is a key. The environmental impacts are all necessary. So there's a great deal of detail, and what we've used, and we found to be very helpful. FEMA does provide for planning grants for projects, and significant grants that can be used to put together all the necessary information to apply for an implementation grant. And that way you have the funding to really put together a robust application. And I find that to be very helpful.
Yeah, and I would say everything that Jim said is absolutely true and is probably also applicable to a lot of other types of not coastal resiliency grants. It just depends on the project, but focusing on coastal resilience, there's a subset of funders that are specifically looking at that. So if what you're really looking at is coastal resilience grants specifically, you're really going to be looking at FEMA, you're going to be looking at NIPWIF. There's a few funders that are kind of really focused on that area. And then I think it's important, and again, this is really for any grant, but there are tools out there that I would say in the last 5 years, the number of free online tools have just exploded that can provide you with free mapping and free evaluation of various demographic components. And so they're very useful when doing coastal resilience grant. They're also very useful when doing any grant. So definitely, look and see what is out there. EPA has the CJES and the EJ screen, which are fantastic tools. And all the federal funders have similar tools. DOT has their own tool for looking at disadvantaged communities, as does HUD. So, make sure you're taking advantage of those tools to help to tell your story. Oftentimes it's required, but there's tools out there that can add additional layers to your story.
And I would just throw in there, go for the planning grant. If the entity has a planning grant and an implementation grant, don't think that you can bypass the planning grant and jump directly to implementation, because chances are they're going to want something that you haven't prepared for, and it helps to build that relationship. It really does help to develop that relationship, especially when they don't know you, personally. Go for the planning grant.
We have another question in the chat. Is anyone familiar with CPRG?
I can go off mute to ask. So CPRG is the Climate Reduction Pollution Grant. It was put out by the US EPA. And that one, nobody knew what to do with. I think it came out like last year, and we really wanted it in Hoboken. And, we have a climate action plan. We just did an update to our climate action plan. We've seen significant reductions since 2017 because of all of our projects. We wanted that money for additional implementation of future projects, and it went nowhere because nobody actually knew where the money was going. They said, Hoboken, you can't apply as a single entity because you're going to fail because you're too small. They also said you should partner with other communities. So we tried to, and then that didn't work. And then the DEP said that they were going to help us and, have a bucket of money, and then that didn't happen. So we're like, what? So I was just wondering if you knew anything about that.
No, and it's hard when the grant is brand new to understand sometimes what the funder is actually looking for. And I've been in that position before. You'll find out once they make the awards, and you'll see exactly what they were looking for, but you probably did everything that you could have done. And sometimes that's just the way it happens.
And Yasmin, what was the acronym? What did that stand for again? Climate pollution?
Climate pollution reduction grant. It was for greenhouse gas emissions reduction.
Jasmine, I'm looking at that. I mean, $5 billion funding source is pretty substantial.
We weren't asking for all 5 billion though. We were just
I
asking, you
understand.
know.
Did you apply for the planning grant?
Yeah, we ended up applying as a partnership with a couple other municipalities and a consultant who wrote the application for us for reuse only. So like food waste. But we figured, you know, food waste was something that nobody would apply for, even though we really wanted it to be for transportation, you know. So yeah.
Colleen mentioned that they helped prepare a CPRG implementation grant for several Connecticut communities who had already obtained a planning grant. Thank you, Colleen.
Yeah, that was the other thing. There was a PCAP, a preliminary climate action plan that had to be put together. And we did that. We worked with the NJTPA, we worked with the DEP, we put together all of our projects, we sent it to them. They said it was in the PCAP. So our understanding was that we could then use that to implement, and then like nothing happened. So I don't know. It's just a little bit of a whirlwind, a lot of work up front for not a lot of action.
I will say there is a webinar actually coming up today at 12. I can put the link in the chat, but it's about implementing New Jersey's PCAP, and it's climate mitigation funding opportunities for local New Jersey governments. So if you're interested in attending that, it's at 12 today. I'll
Thank
put
you.
the link in the chat for you. All right, anything else for our panelists before we close out our coffee chat? I'm going to put their contact information up on the screen, and I want to thank our panelists today for joining us. Their information is listed on the slide if you're interested in reaching out. And at the end of today's coffee chat, you will receive a link for a post-event evaluation. We would love to hear from you and how you think this coffee chat went and how it could help you in your coastal resilience initiatives, locally or regionally. And as a reminder, this coffee chat is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email after the coffee chat when the recording is available on the NJCRC website. So thanks again to our panel speakers. And last but not least, I am going to put a plug in for the next coffee chat. This is June 18th at 11 a.m. It is on the NJ Restores tool, hosted by Rutgers University, that hosts a suite of habitat restoration planning tools in the form of an organized roadmap that takes you from location identification to restoration approaches. So on June 18th, you'll hear from New Jersey Restores collaborators and follow along with a site level project planning demo. So if you're interested in registering for the next coffee chat, you can go ahead and go to the link on the screen or scan the QR code. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Hope you have a great rest of your morning, great afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you at our next coffee chat.